When my husband passed away, I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I never imagined the real heartbreak would come from my own son. This Christmas, I baked cookies, wrapped gifts, and even hung up our old family stockings, trying to bring a little magic back into the house. But when I reached to place a gift under the tree, my son stopped me cold. "There's no room for you here, Mom." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I just turned around, walked out the door, and gave the most precious gift I had to someone else. Helen Moore had lived in the same little white house for over 30 years. Nestled on a quiet stretch of Vermont countryside, it was where she and her late husband, Jim, had raised their only son, David. After Jim passed away 2 years ago, the silence of that house had grown heavier, but Helen filled it with rituals: baking pies, tending the garden, rereading old letters. Her days were quiet, predictable, a little lonely, but anchored in the comfort of routine. Each Christmas, despite being alone, she went through all the motions: baking gingerbread cookies from her mother's recipe, knitting a new pair of red and green mittens, and wrapping up small gifts for the neighbors she barely saw. She even hung their old stockings above the fireplace, including Jim's and David's from when he was 6. David, now 38, lived 2 hours away in a sleek suburban neighborhood with his wife Brittany and their daughter Ellie. Helen didn't visit often. Brittany always seemed distracted, and Helen didn't want to impose. Still, she spoke with David on the phone weekly. He was busy but polite, sometimes warm, other times rushed. She told herself that was just how life was now. Everyone had somewhere to be. So when the phone rang one rainy afternoon in late November, and David said, "Mom, why don't you just move in with us? For good. We've got plenty of room." Helen nearly dropped the spoon she was stirring cookie dough with. "You mean, live with you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "Yeah. Brittany and I talked about it. It just makes sense. You'd be closer to Ellie, and the holidays would feel more full." Helen felt something light up inside her chest. She imagined reading bedtime stories to Ellie, making hot cocoa together, bringing back the kind of Christmas she used to know. "I'd love that," she said softly. Within a week, she had listed her house. It sold quickly, and with the modest savings she had left, she hired movers to help her pack up 3 decades worth of memories. She kept only the essentials: her favorite chair, Jim's record collection, the antique cookie jar shaped like a snowman, and a cedar box filled with hand-sewn ornaments. Everything else she donated. As the moving truck pulled away, Helen stood on the porch and took one last look at the house that had held her entire adult life. She whispered goodbye. The city felt louder, brighter, less familiar. David's house was bigger than she expected. 2 stories, a polished lawn, a modern kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine. Brittany greeted her at the door with a quick hug and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Ellie peeked out from behind her mother's legs, giggled, then ran off. "Your room's upstairs," David said. "It's a little tight right now, but we'll get you settled." Helen followed them up to a small windowless room that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old cardboard. The walls were bare, and a twin mattress lay on the floor. Boxes were stacked against one side. It looked like it had once been a storage room. "I can make this work," Helen said quickly, not wanting to seem ungrateful. That night, as she unpacked her things, she tried to ignore the sense of displacement gnawing at her. She lined up family photos on the dresser, set Jim's records on a low shelf, and hung the stockings in the hallway just as she had back home. The next few days passed in a blur. Brittany was always rushing, dropping off Ellie, picking her up, juggling calls. David was either at work or glued to his laptop. Helen tried to help, folding laundry, prepping dinner, but more than once Brittany gently reminded her, "Oh, I already planned a meal, but thanks anyway. Maybe next time?" One evening, Helen tried to sneak into the kitchen to bake cookies. It was just past 8 p.m. She didn't want to disturb anyone, just to bring a bit of warmth into the house. As she slid the tray into the oven, Brittany appeared in the doorway. "Sorry, Helen. We try not to use the kitchen after Ellie's bedtime. The smells keep her up." "Oh, I didn't know," Helen said quickly. "I'll stop." "No worries," Brittany replied with a smile that turned tight at the corners. "It's just easier that way." The next morning, Helen woke early, excited to offer fresh cookies with breakfast. But when she opened the tin, it was empty. She found the cookies in the trash bin, crumbled and soggy under a pile of paper towels. She stood there for a long moment, staring down, the cold tile floor pressing against her bare feet. Her chest tightened. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe Ellie had gotten into them. She reached for reasons, any reason, because the alternative was too painful. Still, she smiled through breakfast. She made polite conversation. She nodded and said, "Of course," when David told her they'd be skipping their usual Christmas tree shopping tradition this year. Brittany had already ordered an artificial one online. Helen went back to her room and closed the door softly behind her. Helen had spent the entire week preparing for Christmas the only way she knew how, through quiet acts of love. She knitted a tiny red scarf for Ellie, embroidered with little snowflakes. She baked molasses cookies from her grandmother's recipe, adding a touch of clove just like Jim used to like. And she wrapped a small box in gold paper with a white satin ribbon, the kind of ribbon she'd saved for special gifts. Inside the box was a necklace. Not just any necklace. It was made from the gold wedding band Jim had worn for 43 years. After he passed, Helen had it melted down and recast into a delicate heart-shaped pendant, engraved with the date Ellie was born, a keepsake for her granddaughter, a piece of her grandfather, a piece of Helen's own heart. She had hidden it in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, wrapped carefully in velvet. Every night she'd opened it just to peek, just to feel the weight of what it meant. On Christmas Eve, while the rest of the house buzzed in a quiet, sterile rhythm, Brittany wrapping gifts in the guest room, David watching sports, Ellie tucked away with her iPad, Helen had slipped downstairs to decorate a tiny corner of the den. She knew Brittany had already assembled a modern silver and white artificial tree in the living room, but it felt so cold, so impersonal. So Helen had bought a 3-foot spruce from the grocery store and dressed it with the old handmade ornaments she'd brought from her house. Some were a little frayed at the edges, but they carried decades of Christmases inside them. She strung lights, humming "Oh Holy Night" under her breath. For the first time since moving in, the house felt like hers again, even if just in that little pocket of space. Then, at just past 10 o'clock, she tiptoed to her room, took the velvet box from the drawer, and crept toward the big tree in the living room. The house was dim, lit only by the soft pulsing lights on the tree. She reached out slowly to nestle the box beneath it. "Mom?" David's voice was low, flat. Helen turned, startled. He stood at the edge of the hallway, arms crossed. Brittany hovered behind him, her face unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said. Helen blinked. "It's for Ellie, just a little something." David hesitated, then said the words that would stay lodged in Helen's memory for the rest of her life. "There's no room for you here, Mom. Not under the tree. Not in this space." Helen froze, her hand still holding the box. The lights blinked in silence. Brittany didn't speak. Ellie wasn't there. No one else moved. No one looked her in the eye. Helen set the gift down gently on the floor, stood up, and backed away. David didn't say another word. Brittany turned and walked back toward the kitchen. Helen stood alone in the room for what felt like hours. Later, in the dim light of her little room, Helen sat on the edge of her bed. She stared at the walls, at the shadows they cast. Her hands trembled, but she made no sound. She didn't cry. Instead, she picked up the box, placed it back into her coat pocket, and walked quietly down the stairs. No one noticed as she slipped out the front door into the cold night air. The wind cut across the street as she pulled her shawl tighter around her. The world was silent, snow falling in soft tufts around her feet. Across the way, a little girl stood in her yard, wrapped in a thin pink jacket. Her mother stood in the doorway, speaking on the phone, unaware. The girl was maybe 5, with deep brown eyes and a scarf too short to tie. Helen walked up to her, knelt slowly, and held out the velvet box. "Merry Christmas," she said gently. The girl looked at her, confused. "It's something special, just for you." The girl opened the box and gasped. "Is it mine?" Helen nodded. "It's yours now." And then she reached out and pulled the girl into a warm hug. The child smelled of cinnamon and cold air. Helen held her tightly, not wanting to let go. The girl hugged her back, small arms clutching around her neck. When Helen finally pulled away, she smiled. "I hope you always remember how loved you are." The girl beamed, then ran back inside to show her mother. Helen turned and walked toward the bus stop at the end of the street. There were no buses running, she knew that. But it was quiet there, alone, safe. She sat on the bench, hands folded in her lap, and stared out at the streetlights reflecting on the wet pavement. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She just sat there, letting the cold settle into her bones. And when she finally took out a small notepad from her bag and clicked open her pen, she began to write. December 24th, the night I learned how love turns invisible. The morning after Christmas, Helen moved through the house like a ghost, the joyless kind, the kind that haunts not because it wants to, but because it was forced out of life too soon. David and Brittany had taken Ellie out for brunch, a new tradition, apparently, and no one had asked Helen to come. That suited her fine. She needed space. She decided to clean out the small closet in her room. Most of her belongings were still in boxes, half opened, barely touched since the move. As she shuffled through them, she came across a file folder labeled Home Docs. Inside were the original deeds and mortgage paperwork for the Vermont house she had sold. And right behind them, another document she didn't remember packing. It was the deed to David's house. Helen frowned. The paper had her name, listed as the primary owner. She blinked. No, that couldn't be right, but there it was, in black ink. Helen Margaret Moore. Owner, not co-owner, not shared, sole. Her fingers trembled as she flipped to the next page. A bank letter dated only 2 weeks ago. A utility transfer confirmation. The electric and gas services had been switched to David's name, listed as resident account holder. Why would they do that if the house wasn't theirs? A sick feeling rose in her stomach, cold and clenching. She pulled out her phone and called the bank. The woman on the other end was polite, helpful, and entirely unaware of the storm she was about to ignite. "Yes, Mrs. Moore, I can confirm there's a mortgage application in progress for the address in question. The applicant is David Moore, using the property as collateral." Helen's throat went dry. "I didn't authorize that," she whispered. "Your name is still listed as the legal owner. Would you like to place a fraud alert on the account?" Helen ended the call with trembling hands and sat down heavily on the bed. She had given up everything, her house, her town, her quiet life, only to be played, used, positioned like a pawn on someone else's chessboard. The sick feeling didn't pass. It grew sharper. That night, while everyone else was asleep, she retrieved a small black object from her knitting bag, a nanny cam. She had bought it after moving in, unsure if it would ever be needed. She'd placed it just outside her bedroom door, angled toward the hallway. She plugged it into her laptop and scrolled through the footage. For the first couple of nights, it showed nothing, just shadows, silence. Then on December 22nd at 11:16 p.m., the footage showed David and Brittany standing just outside her door, their voices low but clear. "She still hasn't signed anything," Brittany whispered. "She will," David said. "It's just a matter of time. If she wants to stay here, she'll cooperate." Brittany scoffed. "That woman still thinks this is some Hallmark movie. All she's done is bake cookies and smile. God, it's exhausting." Then David laughed, short, dismissive. "If she signs, we can take out the loan. I already have the dealership on hold for the new SUV. And the rest? The renovations, the pool. Hell, we could even flip this place if we wanted. As soon as the house is in my name, we're golden." Then Brittany added, "If she gets suspicious." "She won't. She's desperate to belong." Helen clicked pause. The screen froze on David's face, her son, the boy she'd rocked to sleep, who used to cry when he scraped his knee, who once made her a Mother's Day card with a misspelled "I love you." That boy was gone. What sat on her screen now was a stranger. She didn't cry, not right away. Instead, she just stared at the screen, numb. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't come with screaming or doors slamming. It came in whispers, calculated, cruel. By morning, the house was back to its usual polished silence. Ellie played with her toys. Brittany answered emails. David watched TV. Helen made herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table like nothing had changed. But everything had. Helen didn't confront David immediately, not because she was afraid, but because something didn't add up. His betrayal stung, yes, but it felt incomplete, like a story missing its final sentence. So she waited. She watched. A few days after Christmas, Brittany was home alone in the kitchen, sipping coffee while scrolling through her phone. Helen walked in, calm as a winter pond. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. Brittany didn't look up. "Sure." "I need to ask you something," Helen said. "About the house, about David." Now Brittany looked up. Her face didn't tighten. She didn't go pale. She didn't look guilty. She looked amused. "Might as well," she muttered, setting her mug down, "since the charade is cracking anyway." Helen's heart picked up. She kept her voice steady. "Why are you doing this? The house, the mortgage applications, the manipulation." "Oh, honey," Brittany cut in, leaning back against the counter. "You think I care about the house?" Helen blinked. "You don't?" "I don't want this house. I never did. David thinks he's the puppet master, but the truth is, he's a cheating little coward who's trying to secure assets before I finalize the divorce." The words hit like a slap. "I found the texts months ago," Brittany continued, her voice now ice cold. "He was sleeping with one of his coworkers. Not the first time either. I've been building my case since then, and you were supposed to be my leverage." Helen stared, dumbfounded. "Leverage? Think about it," Brittany shrugged. "He tries to prove you're unfit, unstable, get the house into his name. Meanwhile, I paint myself as the caretaker stuck cleaning up after your delusions. Either way, he loses credibility. I get full custody, no split assets." Helen's knees felt weak. She gripped the back of a chair. "So, both of you were using me?" Brittany gave a half smile. "Don't take it personal. It's just strategy." Just strategy. Helen had been a mother, a grandmother, a grieving widow trying to rebuild something resembling joy. To them, she was nothing more than a chess piece. "You let me knit your daughter a Christmas scarf," she whispered. "I didn't stop you. You let me give her Jim's necklace. I didn't ask for that either." The indifference in Brittany's voice was the final knife. Helen walked out of the kitchen without another word. She closed the door to her room, locked it, and slid down to the floor. She didn't cry. But inside her, something cracked open. Not like a break, but like a shell splitting to reveal something sharper. That night, while the house slept, Helen opened her laptop. She accessed the property records website and began the legal process to amend the deed. As the sole owner, she had every right. She knew who she would give the house to. Not David, not Brittany, not even Ellie, but to someone who had reminded her, even in a fleeting moment, that love could still be innocent, that kindness could be given freely, without strings, the little girl across the street. Helen contacted a local nonprofit that specialized in transitional housing for single mothers and underprivileged children. She explained her plan. The representative hesitated. People rarely donated houses with no strings, but Helen insisted. Quietly, privately, she had the house signed into a trust, with the charity as administrator and the child named as future beneficiary when she turned 18. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, about severing her legacy from the hands of people who had already discarded it. 2 days later, Helen cooked a full dinner, her signature pot roast, homemade bread, apple pie. She set the table with the good china, lit candles, poured wine. David and Brittany arrived home to the smell of food and a mother who greeted them with a smile. "Dinner's ready," Helen said warmly. "Let's eat together tonight." They looked at each other, unsure, but said nothing. The meal was pleasant. Forced laughter, awkward small talk. Ellie played with her peas. Helen played her part perfectly. When dessert came, Helen stood and walked into the other room. She returned with 3 envelopes. "One for each of you," she said, laying them down. David opened his first. Inside, a copy of the house transfer. Brittany opened hers. A full transcript of the audio recording from outside Helen's room. Ellie's was different. Just a small thank you card. Inside was a hand-drawn heart and the words, "Always choose kindness." Helen watched their faces shift. Confusion, disbelief, panic. Brittany stood first, clutching the transcript. David tried to speak, but nothing came. "I thought you should know," Helen said, "where the house really belongs." Then she reached into her bag, pulled out the nanny cam, and placed it on the table. "You recorded us?" David finally said, voice hoarse. "You taught me how," she replied. She took a slow sip of wine, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, she smiled, genuinely, fully, without fear. Helen set the table with precision, each fork aligned perfectly, napkins folded into elegant triangles, candles glowing just enough to soften the tension in the room. It was a Saturday evening, a week after New Year's, but she'd invited them under the guise of a Christmas do-over. She called it a night to start fresh, one last try to bring the family together. David had hesitated when she called. Brittany didn't respond at all, but they both showed up, dressed neatly, guarded expressions on their faces. Ellie ran in first, a burst of energy and innocence. Behind her, Brittany followed, cool and unreadable. David came last, phone in hand, only half present, but Helen greeted them like any mother would, with a smile that felt warm, even if it no longer reached the soul. She had also invited the neighbors, Denise, the single mother across the street, and her daughter, Amara, the little girl who had received Helen's Christmas gift that night on the sidewalk, the only person who'd hugged her with love, not obligation. Denise was hesitant at first, but Helen insisted, "Just join us. I'd like you here." The dinner was delicious. Helen had outdone herself. Roast lamb, scalloped potatoes, cranberry sauce, and buttery dinner rolls. The wine flowed just enough to keep things civil. Conversation skipped awkwardly between weather and school and traffic. No one mentioned the real storm humming underneath. Then, as dessert was served, spiced apple cobbler with vanilla cream, Helen stood. "I have one more gift," she said. David looked up, confused. Brittany's eyes narrowed. Helen walked to the hallway and returned with a red velvet box. She handed it to Amara. The little girl opened it carefully, expecting another trinket. Instead, she pulled out a scroll tied with gold ribbon. Helen turned to the room. Her voice was steady. "This house," she said, "has been my prison and my lesson. I built a life on love and memory, only to watch it be repackaged as leverage and control." David sat up straighter. Helen continued, "So I gave it away, not out of anger, but because kindness should live where it can grow." She looked at Amara and smiled. "I've transferred the house to a scholarship trust. When Amara turns 18, she'll have access to it. Until then, the property is held by a non-profit serving children like her. Brilliant, joyful, and deserving of more than silence." For a second, no one moved. Then Brittany stood abruptly, her chair screeching against the floor. "You can't do that. I already did." David's voice cracked. "This is insane. You don't even know these people." "I know enough," Helen said calmly. "I know they didn't lie to me. I know they didn't try to sell pieces of my life behind my back." David's face went red. "You're ruining everything." "No," Helen said. "I'm finally choosing not to be ruined." Brittany grabbed her purse and turned toward the door. "I'll let the lawyers handle this." Good, Helen said. I've already sent them everything. David stayed seated, hands shaking, lips pressed tight. Amara looked between the adults, unsure, then held up the scroll. What does this mean? It means, Helen said gently, kneeling beside her, you'll always have a place in this world no matter what anyone says. David stood suddenly. You're giving my daughter's future away to a stranger? Helen looked up at him. You gave your own mother's trust away for a car. Don't talk to me about the future. Silence followed. Denise stood and put a protective hand on Amara's shoulder. We should go, she said softly. No, Helen said. Please stay. I'd like you to help me finish the wine. They sat back down. David stormed out. Brittany followed moments later, not looking back. The door closed behind them with a finality that felt less like loss and more like release. Helen exhaled. She poured herself a glass of wine, then filled one for Denise. They toasted softly. Amara sat on the floor beside the fireplace, admiring her scroll as though it were a map to Narnia. That night, when the dishes were done and the house had gone quiet again, Helen walked upstairs. She closed her door. She locked it, not out of fear, but for peace. She changed into her robe and sat on the edge of her bed. The moonlight poured in through the one small window they'd finally installed. Then came a knock at the front door. Helen walked downstairs, cautious but calm. Standing there in the cold was Amara, bundled in her pink jacket, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. My mom said I could come say goodnight, she said, and to say thank you. Helen smiled and knelt down. You're welcome, sweetheart. Amara stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Helen's neck. You gave me a house. Helen held her tightly. No, darling. I gave you hope. The house is just where it lives now. Winter melted into spring slowly, like a song fading rather than ending. The cold pulled back, and with it, the heaviness that had sat in Helen's chest for so many months. Her days began to take on a new rhythm, no longer dictated by silence, obligation, or fear. She started volunteering at the local library twice a week, reading to children during story hour. They called her Miss Helen, and she learned each of their names, their favorite animals, and the exact way they liked their hot chocolate. She found herself laughing more than she had in years. On weekends, she joined a community gardening group. Her fingers, once used to knitting yarn and folding pie dough, found a new kind of comfort in soil and seeds. She planted tomatoes, sunflowers, and rosemary, each one a little declaration of life after ruin. She even joined a writing circle. They met every Thursday in the back room of a local cafe, a group of strangers turned friends who shared poems and short stories and pieces of themselves. Helen brought her journals, the ones she had started that Christmas night, and for the first time, read her words aloud. One morning in early June, David showed up at the library. He waited outside, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes downcast. Helen saw him through the glass and sighed softly. She stepped outside. I'm sorry, he began before she even reached him. She didn't say anything. I messed up, he said. Brittany filed the divorce. I lost my job. The loan's dead. Everything's gone. Helen nodded. I know, she said. I was scared, he added, of not having enough, of failing. I thought if I controlled things, if I managed you, everything else would fall into place. Helen looked at him for a long moment. David, she said gently, you need to learn how to be a man who doesn't need to control love to feel worthy of it. He flinched, but nodded. She placed a hand on his arm, soft, not forgiving, but not cold either. You're not too late, she said, but you're not owed anything either. Then she turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. That night, Amara came over with a drawing. It was a house with pink windows, a garden, and two stick figures holding hands. On the back, she had written in big block letters, Grandma Helen and me. Helen pinned it to the fridge and smiled. They had dinner together, Helen, Amara, and Denise. Afterward, they played board games, laughed over spilled apple juice, and watched a holiday movie even though Christmas was long gone. And yet, somehow, it felt like Christmas had never left. In the quiet hours after they'd gone home, Helen sat at her desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Dear you, whoever you are, wherever you're sitting, reading this, maybe crying, maybe just curious, I want to tell you something. I used to believe Christmas was about being together, about the tree, the gifts, the family photos, but I've learned it's not always about who you sit beside, but who makes room for you in their heart. Sometimes the people you gave everything to will see you as disposable, and sometimes the smallest kindness from a stranger will bring you back to life. I was used, lied to, erased, but I'm still here. And now I am more than someone's mother, someone's burden, someone's guest. I am mine. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, I see you. If you've ever given your best to people who gave you silence, I hear you. And if you've ever wondered whether you're allowed to start over, no matter your age or pain, the answer is yes. With love, Helen Moore." She closed the notebook, placed it beside her bed, and turned off the lamp. Outside, the streetlights cast a soft glow on the sidewalk. Across the room, the tiny Christmas tree she'd rescued from the curb still stood, its lights faint but steady. Amara had insisted they keep it up year-round. "It makes the house happy," she'd said, and maybe she was right. Helen laid back on her pillow, pulled the blanket up, and listened to the quiet, no longer empty but full of possibility. Somewhere down the street, a wind chime danced in the breeze, and just outside her window, the softest sound of laughter echoed, a child's joy, unfiltered and free.